Peace, 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 and love. Today we got a special guest, Dr. Joel P. Christensen, a professor of classical studies at Brandeis University. His expertise is classical philology. Let me repeat that, classical philology. He has done some work with the Homer epic and the relationship between the epics and the mythopoetic traditions, Odyssey, and modern psychology, pedagogy, and Homer epic leadership in the Greek and the Roman world. All right. So before I bring my brother on, I'm going to bring my partner, not partner in crime, but my partner when it comes to these great interviews. Brother Unc, how you doing today, brother?
Hey, what's good, man? How you doing, brother Garfield? What it do, man? What it do?
Right. I'm doing good. I'm doing good. And let me present to everybody, Dr. Joel P. Christensen. How are you doing today, sir?
Good. I'm really happy to be talking to you guys today and, to say hi to whoever ends up watching this video.
Okay. All right. Also, during the interview, I'm going to be flashing 3 books I found out you're a part of, and I'm going to promote them just to let people know what work you have as far as writing stuff. And, you seem to be a lot into Homer and the classical stuff. So this should be a pretty good interview. Let me ask you this before we get into any of the Greek stuff. What made you get into Greek classical history? What made you personally get into it?
It's a good question because people are always like, why do you do this very weird thing? In fact, my wife, whom I've known for since she and I were 17 and 19, has always said, I don't understand why anybody would want to be a classicist. And the answer is that I really love stories. I've always loved storytelling, narratives. And the older I've gotten, I've had different questions about them. I started by wanting the same education that my favorite authors have had. And then as I've moved on through life, I've gotten more interested in what stories do in the world, how they shape the way we see it, act in it, how they give us our identities, and how sometimes they steal them from us. And so ultimately, my interest was in understanding where stories come from. And so I got into Homeric epics because they're old and revered. And the story I usually tell is I didn't like them much. And then I read the Iliad in Greek for the first time when I was in college. And I said, well, this is different. I want to spend some time figuring out why it's different and how it works. And that was 1999. And 25 years later, I'm still trying to figure out how Homeric epic works. And so for me, the passage into Homer was about understanding narrative, but to understand Homer, you have to understand history and language and myth and all these other things. And so it's just been sort of a cycling through different subjects, a learning of new things, and just sort of a following of interests and enthusiasm.
All right, beautiful. All right, so as a child growing up between 8 and 15, right? You see yourself. Did you see yourself into this stuff at that point? And what were your parents trying to get you into?
Well, so I grew up in rural Maine in like the 80s, which meant there wasn't much to be into, pine trees. But again, growing up in rural Maine, if you went to a public library, you were pretty much reading Stephen King at some point. So I think the first book I remember reading that blew my mind and made me think I need to understand more is J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. I read it in 3rd grade. I remember finishing The Lord of the Rings during a hurricane when I was in 5th grade by candlelight. And then moving on to stories like Stephen King's The Stand and It before getting to middle school and high school and doing what we'd now call literature. Most of my friends growing up were probably interested in stories as well. I remember deep conversations about J.R.R. Tolkien. Some of my best friends were also really into role-playing. Dungeons and Dragons was part of my life. But I think the literary part was always sort of like my own personal thing, like The Secret. I was reading all the time. My father was deaf congenitally from birth. So we didn't do things like listen to music together as a family or watch TV or go to movies because closed captioning wasn't a big thing then. Instead, we went to libraries. We read books And to the extent possible, we talked about them. So for me in high school, actually the biggest thing, contrary to my father not being involved in it, was music. When I was in high school and college, I was in rock bands, as white guys with certain length hair were in the 90s. And that was sort of a big part of my world. And so when I went to college and got into studying literature more, it was natural to think about poetry and performance. My perspective as having been on stages, written songs and music, really made me rethink the way that poetry worked in performance in the ancient world. And so in a way, Homer brings it all together in performance. But by and large, most of my peers and friends, 8 through 15, probably thought I was kind of a weirdo. But again, growing up in the 90s, that wasn't quite the liability it might be today.
Okay, beautiful, beautiful. All right, so I know your parents, if they're alive, they're proud of you because you've become a successful college professor at Brandeis University. And to be a philologist is not the easiest thing when you get into Greek. So I have a few questions today that's going to be linguistic based. It's going to be, we're going to talk about what the Afrocentric questions that they have regarding Herodotus. And we're going to talk about Aristotle and pseudo-Aristotle. And we're going to talk about the controversial term melanchroes. Before we go any further, why was Herodotus called the father of history on one side, and then he's called the father of lies on the other side? Why is this? Why are they doing my man Herodotus? Why they doing...
Well, because Herodotus really comes at a join in the expectations of what narrative should be like. So let me give you an idea first of what he was writing, composing in, and why they called him the father of history, and then I'll address that slander, the father of lies. So Herodotus was writing at a time after the Persian Wars and before the Peloponnesian War, or really maybe at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. And so we're really looking at a period from, say, 480 BCE to 430 BCE, which is a rapidly changing period in ancient Greece. Greece had been embedded in the larger Aegean and Mediterranean for some time. But once the Greeks defeated the Persians, they engaged at a new level in what we might think of as the international world. There were already Greek colonists and merchants all over the Mediterranean. But once Athens and Sparta became the dominant powers in the Aegean, they were much more embedded with what we now call the coast of Turkey, the Levant, where Palestine, Israel, Jordan are now, and places like Egypt. So when I talk about ancient Greece, I'm really thinking of anywhere where Greeks spoke and traded and had Greek customs. So from the Black Sea all the way over to the Strait of Gibraltar, there were Greeks everywhere doing Greek things, but also engaging with other peoples. So this is a period where you can see in Herodotus's interests a couple things. One is ethnography. What does the world look like? And in a way, you can think of Herodotus's narrative as something like the National Geographic in the mid-20th centuries, right? Both entertaining people by talking about difference in the world, but also trying to educate them and getting to that weird mixture of being sort of salacious and exploitive, but on the other hand, actually bringing information about the rest of the world to people. And Herodotus was doing this with a larger goal, I think, and most people think, and that larger goal is arguing for a united identity of Greekness at a time when the Greeks were turning and fighting each other. So there's a subtext to Herodotus's narrative, which is plotting out what it means to be Greek in a larger world at a time when people weren't even fully certain that that was one identity. So one thing we always talk about is if you read Homer, there's not one word for Greeks. There are ethnonyms. There are Argives and Danaans and Achaeans named after places that they come from. Whereas in Herodotus, we first get the articulation of that word that Greeks use to this day, Hellenes, the Greeks as a larger group. And so Herodotus was, we think, writing things to be read aloud to people in episodic fashion, then putting it all together. And the way he starts out his narrative is he says, this is the display or publication of the Historia of Herodotus of Halicarnassus. And so Historia there actually means an investigation. its root is related to the Latin verb video. We get our word video from it, and words of sight and seeing. And it implies that you go around, you make an inquiry of something, and then you present your results. And so that word history is really used for the first time, that we know of in that way by Herodotus. And it both implies a method, going around and sort of investigating things, and a goal. And the goal for Herodotus is laying out the causes of things, like how things came to be, what the world is like, in an end-minded pursuit of defining the Greeks against the rest of the world. And so he starts by talking about like the Trojan War, and then moves into the Persian Wars, gives local histories, and then goes through different cultures. He talks about Egyptians, Scythians, Babylonians. Those are the parts that people remember the most because they're kind of wild. Now, this aspect of Herodotus is part of why people sometimes both call him father of history and father of lies. Now, we know we don't have anything close to Herodotus's scale of work from the period. We know that some cities kept local chronicles of their events. We know that ethnography, stories about different peoples and different places were popular. But Herodotus seems to be the first person to bring it all together in this magisterial and long narrative. And so the father of lies thing comes from, I think it starts with authors like Thucydides. So Thucydides is often championed as the father of or founder of scientific history. His history of the Peloponnesian Wars, which were written probably a decade or so, maybe 2 decades after Herodotus's work, tries to take a much more reasoned and logical approach, basing things on facts and like verifiable details, again, in pursuit of the causes of things. But he maligns earlier authors by calling them mythologoi. Mythologoi means tellers of myth, chroniclers of myth. And so for someone like Herodotus, who tells a lot of fantastic tales and blends different genres, Thucydides has contempt, because he's not as scientific, he's not as rational, he's not as reasonable. He's more of a fantasy author in some ways, because so much of what he says is unverifiable. But that being said, nobody else had done anything that we know of even close to Herodotus. And one thing I do want to note about him that I think is worth saying is that he's also a product of a larger Greek identity. He's from one of the cities, the Ionian Greek city-states in Turkey. He's sort of a partisan of Athens to an extent, but he's not a citizen of it. And so he occupies this larger Greek world and has the experience of living on its margin in a way that I think significantly shapes his identity.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well said, well said, well said,
Thank
well
you.
said. Now, a little pushback I have on Herodotus, not on you,
Yeah.
on Herodotus.
Okay.
3 things, right? This might sound silly. 2 and 3 might sound silly, but the first one is, there was an article I was reading on JSTOR when I was doing some research on him, where they said that he may have not even gone to Egypt, right? Where they put out a proposal or a hypothesis saying at a certain time when he was supposed to be in Egypt and he's writing, people in his town or where he's living in the Greek cities is saying, you were here at this time, so how could you be over here in Egypt seeing this, right? So that's one part. The second part is he talks about him witnessing the Egyptians having sex with goats, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if he's using that as something a part of his culture and putting it on the Egyptians, or if it's actually literal. All right. Yeah. The third thing is the story of Sesostris going into the Baltic region and conquering all these areas. It goes to you just use the word can't be verified or substantiated. You just use those words, right? And that story seems to be one of the main stories used in Black Athena too, as that part of the hypothesis from Martin Bernal. But that story is not even in the records of Egypt. And I'm thinking, tell me if I'm wrong, is that one of the perspectives is that he wanted to show the Persians that the Egyptians accomplished as much as they did, because they had ruled in that area that as an empire. So like, hey, the Egyptians did this too, buddy. So don't sleep on what the Egyptians did. The floor is there. all three questions.
All right, so I'll try to keep them all in my mind. But the first thing I want to say is I actually think your last comment shows that you understand Herodotus in a way maybe Martin Bernal didn't, which is that he's not trying to tell the truth. He's trying to tell something like the truth that has specific ends. Right. And so one of the major differences between Herodotus and Thucydides is what I think of in terms of coherence versus correspondence. Right. These are terms from memory science about different operations of memory. But the basic sort of summary is the force of correspondence is when your facts line up with reality. So they correspond to reality. Whereas coherence is when you select or change facts to cohere to a particular story that you want to be true. Prior to Thucydides, most narratives in ancient Greece emphasize coherence over correspondence because it's about telling a story that's persuasive, that has a whole that makes sense together. So to go back to, let me start with your first question. So the first question about Herodotus's travels and stuff, I'm going to be completely agnostic about it. I don't have any idea if he traveled, and I actually don't think it matters so much. And the reason I don't think it matters so much is that if he did travel, I'm not convinced it would have been in any meaningful way, right? Like I can go and tour anywhere in the world briefly, and my impressions of it won't be scientific, they won't be thorough, they'll be totally random. So I think it's more likely that he just talked to lots of people in these cosmopolitan cities, and he made up some stuff too, right? And think about it this way: like you told me that you're originally from Jamaica. If I had a conversation with you about what it's like in Jamaica, you would present to me one series of experiences, and then I could go and tell a story about it that would be based just on your experience of Jamaica. It would be coherent, but it probably wouldn't correspond to anybody else's experience of it, and it may not be useful for future histories. So the ancient world was so complex. We didn't have television, of course, but we also didn't have like highways, trains. So the subcultures of each area were radically different. In I think ways it's really hard for us to understand sitting in the United States where we're so accustomed, especially now, to monoculture. So I think Herodotus had the liberty then to just pick some stories and pick others. When it comes to the goat sex issue, if you look through Herodotus in general, he has a particular interest in other people's sexual habits. He talks about the Babylonians prostituting their daughters, the strange marriage practices of the Scythians. And this is one of those things where it is to forgive the image that I'll give to you. It's like the National Geographic magazines that would always show like topless women from Africa or Papua New Guinea or somewhere. Right? It's that edginess where, like, to the modern Western viewer, it might be a little salacious, but National Geographic and anthropologists can claim that they're not doing that they're just informing you. But editors are still making the choice to depict human beings in a way that may not be salacious for their context, but is for ours. And so it's a weird exploitative thing that I think that Herodotus and modern ethnography really have in common. But I think to go to the final point you make, the examples he shows are really to create a pecking order of civilizations, right? The Greeks have just defeated the Persians, and they want to show that they deserve it, that it's merited, that it's not an accident. And Herodotus is trying to raise up the Greeks in the mind of the Greeks so they band together against others. It's really an act of self-definition. And so he picks stories about other peoples that are funny, that are weird, in order to offset what's different about the Greeks. And one of the most famous sections of this is in, I forget, I think it's book 6 or 7, where the Persians are all together and they have this long dialogue about different forms of government. And there's the King Demaratus from Sparta who's talking about Athens and Greek government. And this is one of those conversations that Thucydides would throw his hands up at and say, this never happened. But for Herodotus, it has a real purpose. And the purpose is to emphasize that the Greek method of governance is superior to all others. And so Garfield, I think going back again to your final comment, I think any details Herodotus has have an end or purpose to them. It's comparative, it's to diminish other cultures, it's to raise up Greeks, but then it's also to entertain people. Because Herodotus was also telling stories in a crowded marketplace of narrative. So he's competing with like stories like Jason and the Argonauts, Heracles' Labors, the Odyssey. And so he also wants to tell a story that grips people. And people are gripped by weird details, gold digging ants, right? Strange things like that. And then the sexual proclivities of others. It's somewhat taboo, but also basic human thing that people are super interested in. It's like a television story where people go around and try different cuisines, and they'll pick the really weird ones that we don't know in order to typify a culture that way. But at the same time, we're picking one thing to the detriment of the whole of a culture.
All right, Brother Ong, do you have a question, or you want me to continue?
Let me see. Are we up to that part yet? I wanted to I wanted to talk about Phaeton in classical Greek mythology, and some of the themes and concepts. I was wondering, was they racializing or showing African skin in a negative connotation?
So I know, Garfield, you showed me a bunch of texts you're going to look at later on. And so the first thing, one of the first words we have that will, let's say, other people from Africa or elsewhere is that word Ethiopian, which seems to mean burnt face or something, and indicates that skin got darker because of proximity to the sun. So my basic feeling about this, Brother Ankh, is that we have racialized the past to such extent, and post, let's say, the colonial movements in Europe, it's so hard for us to see skin language and body language in a non-racial lens that it's almost impenetrable for moderns, right? I think of it like this way, there's a Freudian concept of mutilation, where you're raised in a certain way that your mind is mutilated and you can't think about it in any other way. And I think those of us raised, especially in America, but in Europe as well, in our current racialized context, it's very hard to think outside of it. So I want to give you a different answer, right? So if we think about it like burnt skin, that doesn't have to be negative. It can just be a statement of fact, right? And so another image or discussion I know, Garfield, you want to have later, is the word for darker skin in ancient Greek, and that's melanchroeis, right? Which on its surface just could mean black skin or dark skin. But that word melos, which is used for dark, is also used for the earth and for blood. And so one of the important things, Brother Ankh, to know about Greek color systems is they're not always about hue and pigment in the same way our words are. Instead, they often indicate texture or sheen. And so if we think about something that unites, say, the dark earth, dark blood, and dark skin, for me, it's also about moisture and sheen. So what if instead of seeing melanchroeis as meaning black skin, we thought as meaning sort of rich skinned, or shiny skinned in a different way? And so I think like part of the task of people trying to recuperate the past and understanding it is navigating these differences. So when I see melanchroeis now, I think, well, it could mean, if you think about like blood when you're bleeding, that shine of moisture it has on the top. And then the metaphor can be transferred to darker skin. Or if you think about like a purple grape and the way that it shines, I think it's a descriptive term rather than a judgmental one that later on becomes loaded with judgment as society changes. I don't know if that's too far ranging or didn't answer enough questions, but I think I left enough there that we can keep pushing on it if you'd like to.
Yeah, now that was interesting, talking about the sheen and talking about, I think that's excellent. And you're right about it being unfathomable for people in America to see things any other way, because that's the lenses, specifically the culture was raised under. African Americans,
Right.
European Americans, who was raised under this racialized environment. And based off the studies I have, human beings didn't actually place a value on skin like that. So now it starts to make sense. If you look at beautiful Ethiopian women, they have like a shine to it.
Right.
Like when you really start to open your brain up, you kind of see that. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so for me, like part of it for me, like the opening is like, you know, psychologically, our brains separate things by typologies, right? So that's why like we can make the joke, like, you know, Chinese Americans can make the joke that all Europeans look the same, because when you're in an ethnic group and you have similarities, you define yourself by difference among you, not differences between different ethnic groups until you're in a multicultural society. So I didn't mention this before, but my wife's originally from South India. And when I first met her, she's like, I'm the darkest woman in my family. And I met her family and I grew up with only white people because I grew up in Maine. And I was like, Shanaz, like, you're all the same skin tone, right? That was 25 years ago. And now I'm like, okay, I see it. There are variations. So I think part of the challenge is learning to see with other cultures' eyes, learning to register hair color, eye color, skin color in a different way. So again, when I think back to the terms MELANCHROES, I think when Herodotus is using it, he's using it in an absolutely neutral way. It's just a statement of fact. People from the southern part of the Mediterranean have darker skin than people from Greece. We don't know how dark, but that's another important thing to think about. So the two terms you have that are highlighted there, Garfield, MELANCHROES, and eulotriches, are really interesting terms because they have to be relative, right? So if you think about it, like if you think about light hair or light eyes, right? These are two things that white supremacists get really into in early Greek poetry. Did Helen have blue eyes? Was Achilles blonde-haired, right? The terms that are actually used there, Keanopus, or dark-eyed, cyanide for Helen, and then xanthus for Achilles being light, could be relative terms as well, right? If you have a community with mostly brown hair, light brown hair is light hair. So the terms here, though, MELANCHROES, right? It just means like dark-skinned, and the only real way we can resurrect its meaning is by looking at other uses. And the primary uses for melos in early Greek language as descriptors are, as I said, rich, fertile earth is dark earth. And then blood as it's coming out of the body is melos, right? And so those two things, I mean, these aren't negative terms. Like a fertile earth is a good thing, right? Dark blood is vital blood. And so again, as Brother Ankh said, like, you know, Ethiopian women, dark skin, high shine in the sun, like these images that they're developing. And then eulotriches, the interesting thing is that Odysseus is said to have the woolliest hair of all men. And it's compared to like a ram or a sheep's hair, right? And so here again, eulotriches just means woolly haired. On the surface, there's no judgment. It's just a statement of fact that people have different types of hair. And notice it's not like in a modern American context, right? We would contrast it with straight hair, good hair. Like we'd use judgments that aren't necessarily in the words, but I don't think that's there. Instead, it's a comparison to something everybody in the Greek world knew really well, and that's wool. They didn't have cotton for their clothing. They didn't use much linen. Most of their clothing was made of wool. And so they had a real experience of the processing of wool, from shearing of sheep through the threading, through the weaving of it. And so that, I think, if you give it that cultural context, it really changes the original. It doesn't change the way it's used later, but it changes the way we read the original.
Okay. All right. So in this situation with Herodotus here, and he's referring. So in this sense, how should we interpret it as far as MELANCHROES?
I mean, when I read it, it says they have dark skin and they have woolly hair. Right. I mean, that's the direct Greek reading for the time. Right. Later on, it may acquire different readings, but I think just a direct translation is dark-skinned, woolly-haired.
Okay. All right. So let's have so with the whole thing with Herodotus, as far as him describing Egyptians, you already gave us a whole thing about that. But I wanted to look at another actual description of what he spoke about as far as darkness that's being used a lot. All right. But also he uses the words melanchros to describe, I think Plutarch used it to describe Syrians.
Yep.
Diogenes decided to describe Cypriots. Homer uses it regarding Greeks. So are they saying that those Greeks are dark skinned, but it has so melanchros has a range then? Would you say that it has
absolutely? So I would say, as I was trying to say, not doing it well with some descriptions of like Achilles' hair or Menelaus's hair, these color terms are comparative, right? So in my individual family, we're all Scandinavian, and I may have the darkest skin of the family. So would I be dark skinned in comparison? Maybe, right? So, but with Odysseus, then, yeah, he's described as darker skinned. Part of it may be, and it may be ethnographic, right? It may be he comes from a place in Greece where they have darker skin because they're from the southern islands, or maybe a matter of his experience, right? If you spend 20 years at sea or at war, you're outside all the time, you're going to have darker skin. And if you look at like most Greek vase images have the following conceit: the women have light skin, the men have dark skin. And the reason is that elite women stay inside and they don't get sunburned, whereas men are outside working. And so that's one distinction there. And another one, I just want to go back to the possibility as well, that melos may also indicate vitality, right? Or richness and fertility. Just sticking to those color metaphors and connections between the earth and blood.
Okay. All right. So here's another Herodotus 2.57, where it's used here when he's using the same form of the word, I think melanchros, if I'm correct. And can you break this down for us? He's talking about a dove and the Egyptians.
Yeah. So the part there, in red, so they're saying that that because the dove was red, or the dove is dark or black, it indicates that it was an Egyptian woman. Right. So in whatever dream sequence is going on, I got lost here, or sign, they're saying that in the language of the birds, the dark bird is equated to a dark-skinned woman.
Okay. So that word can be translated as mainly dark skin.
I mean, that's again, when it comes to animals, I would be interested to see like what birds were available at the time. But it could go in the same way, right? It could mean black or just dark, depending on it, depending on the context. It's the closest word the Greeks have to it. And you're giving me some more Herodotus here.
Yeah, Herodotus in 653 2. He's saying, so I use correct reasoning when I said that the Greek record is correct as far back as Perseus, farther back than that if the king's ancestors in each generation from Danae, daughter of Acrisius, upward be reckoned, then the leaders of the Dorians will be shown to be true-born Egyptians. Yep. So what? This is just so confusing because now he's saying the Dorians are Greeks. Like, how is he saying they're true-born Egyptians?
All right, so there are several different layers of representation here that I think are fascinating. And the one thing I want to remark about is that the Greeks have several narratives that trace the royal families, the noble families of myth, to bigger, better cultures outside of Greece, right? So Cadmus, the founder of Thebes, allegedly came from a Phoenician city, right, in search of his sister. Perseus, in some accounts, is actually coming from the Persians. That name sounding is the same, is not an accident. And there are all these traditions for the families of Danaus coming from Egypt up to Greece. And the thing I want to note there is all of these stories have a complicated relationship between indigeneity and settling. So in each case, there's a different relationship between the named founder who comes in and intermarrying or interbreeding with native populations. And so the Greeks have lots of complicated ideas about this. But my reading of stories like this is that at a certain period in their history, the Greeks were super interested in claiming the authority of other cultures they understood as being superior in their achievements. Like when we look at Greece now, and most of this, I actually think Bernal's book is really good on showing how German scholars created the notion of ancient Greece. When we look at Greece now, we think of it as a sophisticated, like blooming of civilization. But I think Greece was a backwater in the Eastern Mediterranean. Like it was the last place in the Eastern Mediterranean to get monumental building, to get sophisticated ideas about astronomy and science. And all of those notions were coming from elsewhere. So prior to the Persian Wars, the Greeks were really just stretching out there, trying to claim some sort of relationship with all of the truly impressive peoples of the Mediterranean. Right. And to be honest, I mean, imagine yourself as a Greek sailor in the 6th century BCE. You end up on the Nile River Delta and you see a pyramid. Nothing in Greece is anywhere close to that. So wouldn't you like have some impetus at that point to associate your people with them?
Yeah.
I think a lot of this comes out of cultural insecurity, right? Which isn't an old story at all, right? The notion that eventually a sense of supremacy comes out of insecurity, I think is part of the story to be told about Greece and the reception of Greece in 18th, 19th century Germany.
Yeah, that's a great take on that. We also look at the Minoans. They had building projects that predate the Greeks. So you're absolutely right. And the way you explain that gives a great perspective and actually understanding what those indigenous people were actually doing and how they didn't just jump to it.
Right.
Monumental building, you have to get ideas from different places. I think the mistake that's always made is that when these cultures come in, they immediately attack the wisdom and libraries, whatever. They don't. They actually take it because that is the value of conquering another civilization, is getting their ideas, their science.
Right.
I think the religion is the hardest thing to transmit between cultures. That's the hard thing, but the science thing is what's valuable. So I appreciate the way you put that together.
Well, and I think, what Herodotus is really a great evidence of is how eager he is to make identifications between Greek gods and Egyptian ones. Right. And so I think this is a particular feature of polytheism that we've lost in the monotheistic religion, is this ability to see unity in difference, right? To go and say, oh, Ammon is like Zeus. We're really just talking about the same deity, but we have different names for them, right? Or early on, there's a Phoenician god hero named Melkart. And the Greeks made an association between Melkart and Heracles early on. But I actually think, to push even further on it, our notion of ethnicity and nation statehood contaminates the way we look at the ancient Mediterranean. Because it's not like there was a border where Greeks stopped being Greeks and Phoenicians stopped being Phoenicians. They had mixed families, they had bilingual people, they had shared traditions. There are all these contact zones that produce different things. And so when I look at ancient Greece, rather than taking, the really mistaken, harmful notion of the Greek miracle, I think the amazing things about ancient Greece are produced by the multicultural contact. By that cross-pollination, by the enjoyment of different cultures. And another text to add, Garfield, to that Herodotus one, is the story of the birth of philosophy by Diogenes Laertius, who, he's a little sketchy on whether it's true or not, but he does repeat the Greek traditions that philosophy and learning came from Egypt, right? Which is a simplification, but if you look at the movement of knowledge, philosophy came to Greece through the ancient Near East and across the sea. The most famous thinkers of the 6th and 5th century were coming from the cities in Ionia Minor that were filled with people from different cultures. And so it's that type of story that we don't tell enough when we talk about the ancient world, because we want it to be monolithic. And I think, to go back to Herodotus, Garfield, I think Herodotus shows a pretty good display of that He may not say, look, we're strong because we're multicultural, but he does give an image of how all these different ideas and peoples and stories came together in Greece and the complexity of the relationships among different peoples.
All right. Let's look at Plato here, which confuses the mind some more, right?
Okay.
He's saying that the Egyptians are kin to Greeks. So he's saying in the delta of Egypt, said Critias, where at its head the stream of the Nile parts in two. There's a certain district called Saetic. The chief city in this district is Sais, the home of King Amasis, the founder of which they say is a goddess whose Egyptian name is Neith, and in Greek, as they assert, Athena. These people profess to be great lovers of Athens and in a measure akin to our people here. And Solon said that when he traveled where he was held in great esteem amongst them, moreover, when he was questioning such of their priests. So that's one part for Plato. Let me read the other part. Because we are pure Hellenes, having no admixture of barbarism in us, for we are not like many others, descendants of Pelops, or Cadmus, or Egyptus, or Danius, who are by nature barbarians, and yet pass for Hellenes and dwell in the midst of us. But we are pure Hellenes. Again, so it's confusing because he's propping up Hellenes, but he's also saying these people could pass for Greeks. If we took literally, we'd be saying, hey, these people are looking, so the Greeks and Egyptians look alike. You know, what's going on here?
Well, so I think part of what's going on in Plato is that, you know, people tend to try to make connections among the dialogues, often missing out on the fact that the dialogues have very specific aims in each one. The Timaeus is really focused on Pythagorean issues, the soul, immortality of the soul, the afterlife, whereas the Menexenus has different concerns. So we shouldn't worry so much about the contradiction, but try to figure out why he's saying what he is in each one. In the Timaeus, he's really trying to activate sort of an ancient, if not even mystical wisdom. And Egypt is standing in part there. So he's willing to have his speaker make an association between Egypt and Greece because it adds to the authority of the argument being made there. And the Menexenus, that's more about fronting the superiority of the Greeks and very specific types of Greeks, in this case, Athenians and Attic speakers. And so this is, you know, it's sort of some intra-Greek rivalry there, saying we're pure and you're not. And I think it definitely gives you some of the seeds of what becomes, you know, a type of Western racism, even if it's not fully fledged yet. So in that one, it's more about distinguishing first between different types of Greeks in the Menexenus, and then Timaeus in grabbing again that desired Egyptian authority, because Egypt was seen as being, you know, an antique and ancient nation that's sort of fallen on hard times.
All right. I have one more for you here, then we could get to Brother Unk. This is from Aristotle, or I should say pseudo-Aristotle. To black, a hue marks a coward as witness Egyptians and Ethiopians. To black, a hue marks the coward as witness Egyptians and Ethiopians. And so does also to white, a complexion, as you may see from women.
Yep.
So what's going on here with this pseudo-Aristotle? Should we even be quoting pseudo-Aristotle?
So pseudo-Aristotle, so one of the problems with Aristotle is that we don't really have what we consider his real work. Instead, we have a series of what people think of as lecture notes instead of treatises. So most of his stuff is really sort of impressionistic and small. And the Aristotelian school was so successful that it's often hard to tell the difference between Aristotle and his students. And so the pseudo-Aristotle stuff is often said, well, this is from the school, but we don't think it's Aristotle. But the ideas expressed in that are not too far off from some things Aristotle says. I personally find Aristotle to be reprehensible in many ways. He, when he writes about monstrosity, for example, he argues that women are less human than men. They're really a deformed version of a man, and goes on and on about this. The way I, as a classicist, would read that passage about the hue of the color is it goes in with a Greek philosophical dictum of maiden agon, or nothing to excess. And so he's setting up this bizarre dichotomy that if you're in extremes of hue, you're a coward, whether it's too white or too black. But he gives no examples or support for his reasoning. And so it just becomes this sort of perverse claim. Aristotle also claims that the best, bravest people come from middle climates when it's not too hot or too cold. And so this is just part of a shtick. The problem with this shtick is that it's been misused by later people who pick it out. And rather than saying, look, it's governed by Greek concepts of nothing to excess and that middle ideal, instead of saying that, they're like, here we go, evidence that Aristotle didn't like people with dark skin at all. Whereas I just think it's just kind of running nonsense. I think we too often discount the fact that Aristotle and some of his followers could be grade A bullshitters when they wanted to be. And this one is one of those that it just sounds like someone's talking a lot of nonsense, and we're missing the part where a friend was like, dude, why are you saying this?
You up.
Okay, so my interest in bringing scientific literacy to the African American community, it took me to Thales of Miletus. That's like one of my favorite Greeks, and he's also known as one of the first Greek philosophers and scientists and mathematician. I think he came up with 5 theorems of elementary geometry. Is it fact or fiction that he actually visited ancient Africa, Egypt, to study geometry, and he brought that to Greece? How close am I to reality with that?
On this one, I'm going to say that it's mostly fiction. But that's just saying that we don't know anything. We don't know much about the pre-Socratic philosophers. Right, Thales is allegedly the founder of science, but we don't know a lot about him. What we do know, and I want to tell a story about a larger pattern, is that he too comes from Asia Minor. And the cities of Asia Minor were filled with people who spoke Lycian, languages related to Hittite, who probably knew some cuneiform. There were people there from Assyrian culture. And so if you look at the stuff he's credited with, it's coming from the Near East, whether it's Egyptian or Babylonian. A lot of Greeks couldn't actually make those distinctions, right? They had no more of an idea of the difference between Egypt and Babylon than, say, an average American might, the difference between, I don't know, Berlin and Frankfurt, right? They're 2 places on the other side of the sea, and so I think that's part of what's going on there. But there's a whole series of figures from that period that are part of what we used to call, and sometimes still call, the rationalizing revolution. And these are figures like Thales, Empedocles, Pythagoras, who typically come from the areas of intense multicultural sharing in the western coast of Italy. And then because of political and martial upheaval, end up traveling to Greece proper and then to the Western world to live in southern Italy and Sicily. And so the fascinating thing about this is that the Greeks were consciously pointing to figures who came from the East, who had experiences of Persia and Assyria and Egypt, and saying, oh, they're the inventors of science. They're not the inventors of it. They just happen to be the purveyors of it from one culture to another. So as a metaphor, though, I think Thales is a really effective story because it does contain that kernel of truth. And the kernel of truth is that the natural science, the astronomy, the seeds of Greek philosophy were imported from other cultures. And that it was probably a mixture of stuff from Egypt, Persia, and Mesopotamian cultures.
Yeah, I could see that. That's why I kind of focused on geometry, because we know they had geometry during that time period.
Yeah.
Let me interject this real quickly. Also, propping yourself up to say you come from Egypt, isn't that a way of you also trying to associate yourself with greatness?
Absolutely, right? You know, I mean, if I go out into the world to try to have some authority to talk about things, I'm going to talk about living in in New York City and getting my PhD at NYU. I'm not going to say I grew up on a dirt road in Maine, right? Unless it's time to talk about pine trees, and then I will absolutely bring up that story, right? So yeah, it's associating yourself with different cultures. It's like, you know, my sister-in-law is super into yoga. And as an Indian, like, she'll claim some authority over yoga because of that. But the secret is, like, she's also Muslim, right? And so yoga is not part of Muslim culture, you know, but she picks and chooses which parts of a culture to activate as it's convenient. And most of us do that to some extent.
I agree with you. The more cultures you learn about, the more sophisticated you come in understanding humanity.
Yeah,
I agree with
absolutely.
you. Mm-hmm.
Got anything else, Unc?
No, I'm still trying to put together that Melanos piece that he directed us through. I thought it was quite.
You mean MELANCHROES?
MELANCHROES, right? I found that to be quite interesting, the way he talked about a different perspective on it. I had never heard that before. That was very, very. And so when you talk about trying to capture the understanding through the eyes of the indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
I think that to be so much important. And you also talk about how we place our value system on these ancient cultures. And I think that what that does for me is it takes away from the value that we could actually get from studying these cultures. So I'm glad you kind of piece that together like that. And I guess this is why it's important to kind of talk to professors sometimes, because a lot of information we get is bits and pieces, and we stand on it and it'd be crazy sometimes.
Well, it's also, I mean, we live in an era that's an embarrassment of riches when it comes to information, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we have fewer skills for judging the quality of the information. And we also have yet to done sufficient work to question the production of knowledge under Western colonialist institutions. So when we get information, especially about languages and cultures, that's being driven from, let's say, 19th century and 20th century scholarship, like, we are all affected by the water that we swim in. So if you are in a primarily racialized and racist society, it's really hard to think outside of that. So it's really hard to think of Black skin meaning something different when you've constantly been raised in a culture that sees it in the same way. But an example I always love to give is there's this epithet in Homeric language that's wine dark. So we always talk about the wine dark sea. And some people have said, you know, there's this argument that, oh, the Greeks didn't have a word or concept of the color blue, which is nonsense. They did. Instead, though, the wine dark sea is probably not about the color of wine, but about Greek wine, which always had sediment in it. They didn't filter their wine. So if you swished wine around, you'd see sediment moving around in it. You'd see the different colors on the surface. And so wine dark sea isn't about the sea being red. It's about the sea being murky and changing with sedimentation as it sloshes around. So I always use that as a tuning moment when I think about ancient color terms, right? And so you can't just say dark skin. You have to look at what else does melos apply to. And the three words that I know it applies to are red grapes, fertile earth, and blood. Right? And those things, what do they represent? Like a red full grape, right, is ripe and it's shining. An earth that's dark it's moist, it's fertile, it's good for planting. And blood shines, right? It shines when it comes out, and it's dark, but you wouldn't call it black.
But that word covers it. But let me ask you this though: what about the honey element to it, where we have like Melissa or Melinda is connected to MELANCHROES, in that melas is the root word, or melis, and meli is the root word, which actually means honey. How does that play a role in determining the meaning or the skin tone or the blood or whatever? How does that determine it?
This is a great question, and I'm afraid you're not going to like my answer. I think I think we're talking about a false cognate here. Right?
Mhm.
So in linguistics, when we talk about cognates, we talk about words that are related based on their forms. False cognates are words that happen to look to get alike but aren't. And so the word, so I'm looking right now on my screen at a etymological dictionary of ancient Greek by a man named Beckus. And he separates the roots for meli, honey, sweet, and melos for dark, and says that they come from different places. So for melos, it comes from an ancient root that does seem to mean black or dark, and is in lots of comparisons, and relates it to, interestingly, other words that may have more to do with texture. So it's related to a Lithuanian word mulvos, which means yellow clay, a word from Latvian as well that means blue spot or dark blue. And so it always seems to have a color associations with it. And after this conversation with you gentlemen, I'm looking at this and thinking how contaminated our dictionary is by our color suppositions, because it starts out by saying all dark colored things, but then gives the comparison, and it's a wide rainbow of different colors. The word meli, on the other hand, has it pretty much cross-culturally is always a sweet word, right? And so other words that have to do with it are like a word for methu, which can mean white, dark wine, but generally has to do with honey. So the word melissa for bee is directly about like the thing that gets honey. But now that I've said they're false cognates, it doesn't mean that people couldn't have conflated them. One of the things I always try to emphasize about etymologies is that just because somebody is fluent in a language doesn't mean they know the historical origins of words, right? And so folk etymologies or false etymologies are often as productive or meaningful in a culture as the accurate ones. So I want to draw that distinction. Just because meli for sweet and melos for dark come from different roots traditionally doesn't mean that they weren't conflated at some point by different cultures.
All right, beautiful. My last question is regarding something that we spoke about earlier, but we're gonna put it on the screen so we all could see it together. Interpretatio Graeca, or interpretation by means of Greek models, is a discourse used to interpret or attempt to understand the mythology and religion of other cultures. A comparative mythology using ancient Greek religious concepts and practices, deities and myth, equivalencies, and shared characteristics. So that's what I wanted to bring up when we talked about people saying, hey, you know what, this model here is in Egypt, but this is in Greek, and they say, hey, you know what, that's something that we did we did in Greece, or we got it from the Egyptians because they looked at us as the top dogs in technology and everything, so we associate ourselves with them.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, like about the way this works. And the one thing about it that always makes me uncomfortable, and I think I'd like to hear Brother Ank's Afrocentrist take on this as well, is how it centers one culture's experiences and concepts in the process of comparison, which guides the view in a different way. And so for me, when I'm interested in comparative narratives, comparative religion, one of the reasons something like this makes me uncomfortable or nervous is when you go out in the world, for example, following Joseph Campbell, looking for patterns that are like the heroic pattern in Greek myth, you're going to find those and ignore other things that are indigenous to that culture or different. Right. And so, the Interpretatio Graeca, it's not a terrible method, but you need to check it at times to say, look, what is our goal here? Is our goal to merely reinforce the Greek culture or to see how other cultures are like it? Or is it to, in fact, do real comparative work, which requires decentering that model to an extent? As a humorist, people often ask me why I don't do more with comparative epic. They'll bring up, African epic, Middle Eastern epic, and I say I completely mistrust my own ability to engage with those other traditions fairly. I don't know the languages well. I can't put the time in. And if I go there and I just pick models and parallels in order to enhance our understanding of Greek epic, I'm engaging in an essentially colonialist discourse that really doesn't need to happen. Right? I can talk about Greek epic exclusively without raiding other people's culture. To truly do comparative work, you need to be embedded in it, learn about it more, and try centering it more. So I think, if I remember correctly from some of the readings, an Africanist criticism of Bernal is the continued reification of the Western tradition by centering it rather than other narrative traditions and selecting details in a very specific way. But I'm sure I haven't done that justice. Brother Ankh, what's your sort of take on that?
First correction, I'm not an Afrocentric.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, well, I asked him, I'm a Black American, African American, and I'm just interested in understanding ancient cultures and transmitting that to Afrocentrics, to other African Americans, and just people of color in general.
Yeah.
So yes, I think it to be very important to actually access other mythologies and actually understand it in this cultural container. I think it's important to move the world forward. When you see success in the world, you see different groups, different ethnicities coming together, different hodgepodge of ideas. That's what actually moves the world forward. When you get stuck in a box, right, you find yourself ended up being a hunter-gatherer with other people in the space age. So constant human communication and understanding culture and mythology is essential for treating people right at the end of the day and transmitting ideas to move us forward. So yes, I think that's important.
I like your metaphor, the hunter-gatherer, in two ways. One, it shows that those of us who like box ourselves off are stuck in the Stone Age, but also I think it's a good metaphor for the way certain scholars and people go out and cherry pick from other cultures only what's useful without truly understanding them. Like, you go out and hunt for something, you're likely to find it.
Absolutely. And that's why I think this interview is essential, because you open up a broad range of new thought on situations. And that is so important for our education and just as human beings in general, to get this thing right. Because at the end of the day, we're going to have to work with each other to make things pop off, right? Education has to be transmitted. Marginalized communities don't have access to professors such as yourself. I think that's important. And it also shows where you can go. Yeah. It shows what you can actually become. So that's why these interviews, me and Brother Garfield present, actually gives the community a chance to say, man, I could do that.
Yeah.
I could actually do that. And I'm not afraid to tackle it and get the information. A lot of times we go into this thing, like you said, cherry picking. But when you cherry pick, you only get one point. You're not getting the whole essence of what the ancients was trying to convey. And I think that's more important. If the statement is true, he who knows about his history understands the present, and he who understands the present will understand the future. If that is important, then you got to capture what the indigenous ideas was.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, I'm done here, man.
Okay.
Joining us. Joel, this was pretty good. I learned a lot today, man. You're a great guy, and keep doing what you're doing, and I appreciate you.
Hey, thank you for having me, guys. It's great to meet
appreciate you, Joe. It's a great conversation. You've definitely added to our content of